My name is Randi Knott. I was born in California. We moved to Minnesota, lived in Minnesota for a long time, moved to Ohio, and that's where I graduated from high school. Went to college at Ohio University. After I graduated, went to Chicago and retired from AT&T and moved to Greeneville, and that's where I live right now. What first interested me in Sam and Dolly and the slaves of Andrew Johnson was I took a tour of the homestead, and there was a mention of them, but there wasn't very much known. They didn't even know how many slaves Andrew Johnson had. And I made kind of a mental note. The thing that really got me going was I was going through Margaret Patterson's baby book, and I found a picture of a woman that looked just like Dolly, but the date was 1904. So I knew it couldn't have been Dolly. And the signature, the description on the photograph said, Mammy Dora. And I didn't know what that meant, but I thought she looked so much like Dolly that there had to have been a connection. So I went to the census records and I found Dora was the oldest daughter or the oldest child of Sam. And then the floodgates opened from there. I was able to start putting the pieces together. The photograph that I found of Dora was in Margaret Patterson's baby book. And Margaret Patterson, who became Margaret Patterson Bartlett, was the great-granddaughter of President Andrew Johnson. When I first learned about Dora, then I wanted to know about the other members of the family. So the first thing I looked at was, who did she marry? Well, she married a man named William McGee. And when I went back through some of the old newspapers, I found that William McGee was a school teacher. Well, it took me a long time to learn his history because he was in the military. He fought in the Civil War, but he fought for the 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry. And those military records, I couldn't get through the National Archives. The Kansas State Library put them online, and then I was able to learn about him. And he had a fabulously interesting life. From there, I learned about their children. And I think probably around 1900, many of the children moved from Greeneville to Knoxville. My estimation is that there were better career opportunities. So William was a school teacher. His daughter Adrian was a school teacher, and Adrian married a school teacher. So obviously education was very important to the family. Sam wrote a letter to President Johnson when Johnson was in office and asked to help secure some land to establish a freedmen's school. And the conjecture is that William McGee came to Greeneville to teach in the freedmen's school. That's our theory. And because of that, William and Sam became acquainted, and conjecture, that's how William married Dora. So there's that long history of education and wanting to establish schools in Greeneville for the African American students. It was only referred to as the Freedmen's School. I have early records that, geographically we know where it was. It was where the Greeneville Light and Power building is right now. And we have a photograph of it when, at the time, it was the electric company. They took a picture of the building before it was torn down. It was torn down in 1964. There are references to the Freedmen's School being in the basement or the first level of the Ray Academy. The Ray Academy was one of the first educational facilities built in Greeneville. I think it was built in the early 1800s. And so we know that the Freedmen School occupied part of that. Then at another point, we have a newspaper article all about I think it's the 1880s, about the African enrollment in Greeneville. One of the things I do when I look for information on Sam Johnson, Dolly Johnson, any of the former slaves of Andrew Johnson, we have the oral histories, but I try to use primary source material to help me fill out their story. And so the first piece of documentation I have on Sam is his slave sale. And a man named Elam Carter sold Sam Johnson to Andrew Johnson. And I have a copy of that documentation. So that is really where the story of Sam starts for me. Again, we have newspaper articles that Charles Johnson, the son of Andrew Johnson, was interviewed, and he talked about Sam and what an independent nature Sam Johnson had. This comes from the Andrew Johnson Papers, Volume 3, and it's footnoted in a letter from Charles Johnson. Sam, born about 1830, was purchased by Johnson in 1842. He proudly boasts that he was the latter's first servant. Johnson's favorite slave, he possessed an independent nature and lordly attitudes, encouraged no doubt by the excessive indulgence of his master. In later years, we are told that Sam's aristocratic feelings were revealed when, as a janitor of a local church, he regularly wore a silk hat, long-tailed coat, and as of 1901, he was still living in Greeneville. Sam, this is according to, let's see, Margaret Royal's book, and from Robert Winston's book. I guess it's titled Andrew Johnson, the Presidential Scapegoat, and Andrew Johnson, Plebeian and Patriot, respectively. This is a quote. Negro Sam boasted that he was Johnson's first servant, and he constantly imitated his master in speech and dress, wearing Johnson's discarded black broadcloth silk hat with a plum. And this is according to Wilson's book, Robert Wilson's book. Now as to old Sam, Johnson's favorite slave, it was most true he did rest amidst velvet and feathers. In fact, according to Mrs. Patterson, it was a mistake to call Sam a slave at all. She often laughed and said that Sam did not belong to her father, but her father belonged to Sam. Tall and dignified, black as coal, Sam was one of the best-known characters in Greeneville and a thorough gentleman. He was at least an aristocrat. A note in the passage says that after Sam was set free, he bought a silk hat, a long-tailed coat, and became a church janitor, respectfully and courteous. He looked like a lord. The oral story is that Dolly approached he wasn't president at the time. Dolly approached Andrew Johnson, and she thought he had a kind face. And so she asked him to purchase her, which, according to oral tradition, he did. And after he did, she convinced him to go back and buy Sam. So what William Johnson, the youngest of Dolly Johnson's children, when he was interviewed by Ernie Pyle in 1937, he said, "My mother was a good-looking woman," William said. "Her owner sold her at an auction at Greeneville. She looked around the crowd of buyers before the auction started, and she saw Andrew Johnson and liked his looks. So she went up to him and asked him if he wouldn't buy her. He bid on her for $500, and he bought my uncle, her brother, for $450. So that is from William Johnson. He said, I hadn't been born yet when this happened. I was born into slavery under Andrew Johnson. When I was little, Mr. Andrew used to hold me on one knee and my sister on the other, and he'd rub our heads and laugh. William chuckled to himself when he tells this. One day, Mrs. Johnson called us all in, William goes on, and he said we were free now. She said we were free to go, or we could stay if we wanted to. We all stayed. I was only 7 when Mr. Andrew was president, and I never went to Washington with him. But after he came back from Washington, I was with him all the time. I slept right in the same room with him when he was elected senator, but he died before he could get back to Washington. He died in 1875 when I was 17. After emancipation, it appears to me, because we don't have an 1890 census, the family or the former slaves of President Johnson stayed in Greeneville until his death, which was in 1875. I think that started the family thinking about moving on. In the case of Dora, who was his oldest daughter, she stayed in Greeneville, and that's where her husband died. They are both buried there, as is their youngest daughter is also buried in Greeneville. Their oldest daughter was called Blanche, but they called her Blaney. She ended up in New Jersey, and I haven't been able to find anything about her yet. She's on my list. The second daughter, Adrienne, moved to Knoxville and became a school teacher. She retired as a school teacher and she married a school teacher. And they're both buried at the Knoxville College Cemetery. Their third daughter, Hazel, married a man up in Sullivan County, but they divorced, and so she came back to Knoxville. Their fourth child, her name was Willie Mae. She married a man from Big Stone Gap, Virginia. Go back a little bit. It appears to be that Sam was one of the founding members of Greeneville's first African-American Presbyterian church. And the family stayed Presbyterians in Greeneville for as long as I can find. And there was an African-American Presbyterian church in Big Stone Gap, Virginia. And according to the church records, there was a lot of visiting between the two churches. And so it's speculation on my part that that is how Willie Mae married a man from Big Stone Gap. Then there was a son, Robert Johnson, but I have never found one piece of information other than his name once in a census record. The third child was named Hattie Johnson, and Hattie married Edward Pulliam. Edward Pulliam was a Buffalo soldier, and according to his military records, he fought in Texas. So he was in the service from, I think, 1867 until 71. They ended up moving to Washington, D.C., and apparently there were good job opportunities for people in D.C. He worked for the printing and engraving part of the government. I have that, I can do that better. But anyway, so they moved to D.C. And he and his family all worked for the government. So he retired with a military pension, and he retired with a government pension and a salary. So they did very well for themselves. They had one son, and he died in 1915. Their next daughter was Mary Johnson, and I have not found a speck of information on her death. She did marry a man named Anderson Gahagan, and I have a whole history on the Gahagan family. And I just found out that Anderson Gahagan died in Knoxville in 1913. So at some point, Anderson was a widower. He was widowed. And he and his son and his son's name was Johnson Gahagan. And they moved to Knoxville. Anderson died in 1913. Johnson Gahagan then moved to Chicago, and he worked for the steel company. Actually, it was out of Hammond, Indiana, but he was working in Chicago, which was another draw for people to go to the industrial cities. Fanny Johnson married a William Price, and they moved to Columbus. And then Beatrice was the youngest, and they moved to New Jersey and started a newspaper. For the Willie Mae, who went to Big Stone Gap, Virginia, her husband was a chauffeur for a private company. So, and that's the only couple direct descendants of Sam Johnson that I know of that went to Big Stone Gap. There are references later on in the history of the family that people were from Big Stone Gap, but for the immediate descendants of Sam and Margaret, that's the only one that went to Big Stone Gap. To me, the legacy of Sam Johnson and Dolly Johnson is, without them, a big part of Andrew Johnson's life would have been very different, I think. He purchased slaves, but he said he never sold a slave. He emancipated his slaves, and he emancipated the slaves in Tennessee. So African Americans and slavery, to me, was a very important part of his life. And I think the legacy that Sam Johnson and Dolly Johnson left to us is that they left a legacy. They left slavery, but they and their descendants became independent people. They started newspapers. They were educators. Florence's obituary. Florence was the third child, or the second daughter of Dolly. She was a laundress, but she used her funds to send Knoxville students, African American students, to college. So to me, they left a very strong legacy of philanthropy, education. Education was very important to the family, it seemed to me. So to me, that's the legacy, is that those people changed Andrew Johnson profoundly, I think, and that they made the world a better place. We know so little, I know so little about Dolly, because there's very little evidence or written documentation on Dolly Johnson. We know from a newspaper clipping that in 1881 she started a bakery in Greeneville, and oral tradition is that it was in the tailor shop. So she was enterprising. We know that William Johnson, Dolly's youngest child, became a famous chef here in Knoxville. So we know that they were professionals, that they were good at what they did. Like I said, we know Sam was a bit of a character. We know that he, according to what we've written or what we've read, he was indulged by Andrew Johnson. So from what we read from William, Andrew Johnson would take Flora and William and put him on their knee and show them physical affection. There is evidence that Andrew Johnson bought gifts for Elizabeth and William and Florence. So it was a very positive environment for them. I think they took that and made the best they could with their life. Now, the sad part is, when William got older, he couldn't work. He ended up at the poor farm. Now, Margaret Patterson Bartlett, we have receipts that she sent checks to support him, but it was obviously not enough for him. Many of the descendants, when they became older, lived in poverty. And that's just the way their lives were. They did the best they could with what they had, and sometimes they flourished. Sometimes because they worked as a laborer, their lives were a lot harder. The death certificate for Elizabeth, the cause of death for her was paralysis. What was it like for her husband, who had to work and support themselves, but had a paralyzed wife at home? The slave sale of Sam. So he was a piece of property, you know? I mean, they sold mules the same way they sold slaves. I mean, so that's the reality of the situation. But how Andrew Johnson came about purchasing Dolly and Sam came from the story that William Johnson told, which was Andrew Johnson was at a slave auction, and according to this, the slave auction was in Greeneville, or just outside of Greeneville. And that Dolly was there and knew she was going to be sold, so she looked around at the people that were there. She saw Andrew Johnson. She thought he had a kind face, and she went up to him and said, "Please buy me." And he did. And after that happened, she said, "Please buy my brother." And he did. Greeneville was a village. It was prosperous. It was a prosperous village. But it was agricultural. And Andrew Johnson was extremely popular. He was from a working class background, and he supported the working class people in Greeneville. And he was very popular. He was down to earth. They respected him for his being frugal. They respected him for his honesty. I've never seen anything in writing to explain why Andrew Johnson did what he did. But based on what William said, on how he treated Florence and William, he treated them as family members. And the only thing that I can think of is that this was the Civil War. All the horrors of slavery were unfolding, although he probably knew that already. But I think he just finally said, this is my family. And for whatever that means, whatever family means. But these are our children that were raised in my house. They played with my children. You know, I raised these people. And he said, it's just not right for them to be sold and be sold as cattle, and same thing you do, like I said, with a mule or a horse or whatever. And that's just speculation on my part, but given what William said, what his life was like, that he was just a normal child in this family, I think that that's what motivated Andrew Johnson to emancipate his slaves. Well, according to William Johnson, he said Mrs. Johnson called them all together and said they were free, that they could stay or they could go. They all chose to stay. The fact that the next generation stayed also said something about their feelings toward the President Andrew Johnson's family. I have a photograph of Sam's oldest daughter in 1904. She was invited to Margaret Patterson's birthday, her first birthday, and they took a photograph of Dora holding Margaret. To me, that means that Dora was an important part of that family. The oral history of the origination of the August 8th celebration, of course, is that they were emancipated on August 8th, 1863. But again, oral history tells us that it was Sam that got the whole celebration started. And I think there are some early newspaper clippings, I think from the 1870s, that talk about that. I've seen newspaper clippings that Sam was the master of ceremony, he led the parade. I've never seen anything written that said definitively, Sam says, I'm going to have a parade to celebrate this event. But the oral history tells us that it was Sam that started this, the August 8th celebration. The emancipation of Sam, Dolly, Elizabeth, Florence, and William was retold by William to Ernie Pyle. So it came from William's own lips. So no, nothing has been written. Andrew Johnson didn't sign a proclamation. He didn't sign any legal papers that I know of emancipating them, but from William's description is how we learned they were emancipated. To me, Greeneville's position in the August 8th celebration is that we're the crucible. We are where it started. This is, if it weren't for President Andrew Johnson emancipating his slaves in Greeneville, Tennessee, and Sam living in Greeneville and supposedly starting this event, there would be no August 8th. We are the ground zero for the August 8th celebration. And I will say that very proudly. And I don't care what anybody in Knoxville says. We are it. This was a very close family. Elizabeth, Florence, and William were very close. William never, to the best of my knowledge, William never lived by himself. He always lived with one of his sisters. Aunt Florence, as she was known to hundreds, was born in Greene County, belonging to the family of Andrew Johnson, then Taylor. After President Johnson's term had expired, she returned to Greeneville, where she made her home until about 18 years ago when she moved to Knoxville. She was a woman who made the most of her opportunities, and with the funds at her disposal, helped many worthy young persons of her race in their efforts to go through college. Her home was a mecca for visitors, many well-known Knoxville people taking their out-of-town visitors there to hear the wonderful tales of the Old South that Aunt Florence would relate. Surviving is her one brother, Will Johnson, and one son, Edgar. Edward Pulliam was married before he married Hattie, but they divorced. His daughter attended Fisk, and she graduated from Fisk and attended Columbia. I guess she was, according to her obituary, was a fabulous musician. So that, to me, says a lot. Now, Edward Pulliam, whose first daughter, attended Fisk and Columbia, his son died quite young, and this is a memorial by the family. In sad but loving remembrance of our beloved son and father, Roy E. Pulliam, who departed this life 3 years ago, today, July 10th, 1915. 3 sad years with all their changes, since death made us strangely apart. But dear Roy, all these changes could not take away you from our heart. By his father and mother, Edward and Hattie Pulliam. For oft my thoughts go wandering to the grave so far away, where lie the sweetest memories that shall never fade away. It's a very, very close family, and then that's what comes through to me, is how much how close the families were and how they cared for one another.